Feel free to keep those intros coming in the chat box. People are just putting their name and their affiliation or RCP or both, and favorite fall activity just for fun. So welcome everybody. On behalf of Highstead, Audubon Vermont, and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, I want to thank you for joining us today. We have a really great program for you. My name is Katie Blake, and I'm a conservationist at Highstead, a conservation nonprofit based in Reading, Connecticut. And in my role at Highstead, I support the work of regional conservation partnerships, or RCPs, in their efforts to increase the pace and scale of conservation across the Northeast. And I'm joined today by two co-hosts, Sarah Barker from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, who directs the Cornell Land Trust Bird Conservation Initiative, and Steve Hagenboom, conservation biologist and forester at Audubon Vermont, who will be delivering the program, and I'll be turning it over to him in just a few minutes. So this webinar, Bird-friendly Forestry Practices and Strategies for Landowners, is the third of 4 webinars in our series. Next slide, please. And so today's webinar will explore specific forest management activities and silvicultural options designed to enhance bird habitat while also achieving timber and non-timber forest product, climate adaptation and mitigation, and other ecosystem services goals. Last week's webinar, titled Habitat Requirements and Management Considerations for Forest Birds in New England, looked at which forest conditions and attributes provide high quality nesting and foraging habitat for a range of priority bird species found in the Northeast. And just to note that these webinars are being recorded so that they can be shared with all of the registrants and those that aren't able to attend. And we'll be posting this on our website, and I'll share them in follow-up emails. But we can also share the links to the previous 2 recordings right now in the chat box. And as a reminder, continuing forestry education credits are available for this webinar. So stay to the end. There'll be a Google attendance sheet will be provided. We'll put a link in the chat box. And so you have to sign that doc in order to receive credits. Next slide, please. This event is brought to you by the Northeast Bird Habitat Conservation Initiative, represented here by a very diverse suite of participating partners. And this collaborative effort is between RCPs and their partners, Audubon groups across the Northeast, Highstead, and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And the goal is to help RCPs connect with bird conservation in ways that expand and advance their efforts, their partnerships, and their ecological priorities. The group also aims to raise awareness and the collective knowledge about the importance of bird conservation and the role the RCPs and landowners can play in protecting and restoring habitat for declining populations. And so Highstead supports this initiative by serving as a co-leading organization along with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And so in my role at Highstead, I serve as a co-lead along with my partner and fellow co-host today, Sarah Barker. And our initiative received a grant that has allowed us to put on this webinar series and specifically gear it toward RCP and land trust leaders in order to bring you the tools that you need for conservation and management practices. Next slide. So now I'd like to turn it over to our program host for today, Steve Hagenboom. Steve has worked with Audubon in a variety of roles since 1998. And currently he's the senior conservation biologist and forester with Audubon Vermont's Healthy Forest Initiative. And in this position, Steve works with private landowners, municipalities, foresters, land managers, and other conservation partners to promote management activities that will enhance the health and habitat value of forest land for priority bird species. He played a key role in developing the national award-winning Foresters for the Birds program, and more recently, Bird-friendly Maple. In 2009, Steve obtained his master's degree in conservation biology from Antioch University, New England. And when not in the woods on business, Steve can still be found there, hiking, mountain biking, backcountry skiing, exploring with his kids, or whatever else seems like fun. And Steve, his wife, and their 2 children live in Waterbury Center, Vermont, where they run a small farm business. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve.
Great, thanks, Katie. And good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank you all for joining us today. It is, as Katie had you all put into the chat as you were arriving here, what's your favorite fall activity? Well, here in Vermont, fall is definitely in the air today. It's a kind of a cool day, and those fall activities are definitely pertinent for where we are. So thanks for taking time out of your fall day to be with us and to participate in this webinar series. I also want to really thank Highstead, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and the Northeast Bird Habitat Conservation Initiative for the invitation to present this 4-part webinar series on managing our forests with birds in mind. It's been a real pleasure to do the 2 webinars we've done thus far, and definitely looking forward to today's webinar and then the final webinar, which will be 2 weeks from today. In just a few moments, we'll be joined by another co-presenter today, Nancy Patch, and I'll introduce her a little bit more fully here in just a few minutes, but really excited to have Nancy as a co-presenter here with us today for her valuable experience that she offers to these topics that we'll be discussing. And then last but not least, before we really get things rolling, we encourage and invite questions on any of the things that we're discussing today. If you do have questions, please go ahead and put those into the chat box, and then we will get to each one of those at the end of the presentation. So as Katie mentioned, I'm a conservation biologist and forester with Audubon Vermont. Audubon, if you're not familiar with Audubon as an organization, our mission is quite simply to protect birds in the places that they need today and tomorrow. And as we've been discussing in the webinars to date, really one of the really important places that birds need here in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states are our forests, and henceforth our focus on forest in this webinar series. And today, our focus is on bird-friendly forestry practices and strategies that landowners can employ to incorporate bird habitat considerations into the management of their woods. If you were able to join us for one or both of the previous webinars, welcome back. If this is your first one, special welcome to joining us. I just wanted to give a real quick overview as to what it is that we've been covering in the webinars to date to kind of bring everybody up to speed. So in the first webinar, we really looked at how we can utilize birds as motivators and ambassadors for thinking about excellent forest stewardship on the ground, using the way that birds capture people's imaginations and people's interest in birds to really help to encourage people to think of good stewardship behaviors. And we also had a special guest 2 weeks ago on this topic, Annette Goyne, who is a private forest landowner that is part of the Cold Hollow of Canada Regional Conservation Partnership, and she was able to share with us how birds have helped her and her husband think about how they are managing their property in northern Vermont. Last week, we got a little deeper dive into some of the habitat requirements that our northeastern forest birds require. What are they looking for when they come here to hopefully nest during the spring and summer months? And then Dan Kilborn, from a forester with Vermont Land Trust, shared an excellent in-depth presentation on how he has been incorporating those concepts into the management of some of the land that the Vermont Land Trust owns in fee. So today we're going to kind of move it right along the series, kind of to the next iteration, which is now that we know how powerful birds are in getting people to think about forest stewardship. What do those birds need? Now we're really going to dive into what is it that we can actually do, what kinds of specific management practices and silvicultural options do we have to help create those conditions that birds will be looking for. So this is these are 2 images that we have seen before. I think we actually saw them in both of the previous 2 presentations. But I want to come back to them because there's an obvious theme here. And the theme being that on the left, we have our mature forest habitat in the background with a variety of the priority bird species for the Northeast that we think about when we're out there considering stewardship and management of our forests. And then on the right, we have more of a younger forest, open canopy, shrubbier condition, and a suite of bird species that correspondingly look to use those conditions for nesting habitat as well. And whether it be mature forest or young forest habitat, one of the key things that's really critical in order to realize the different structural attributes of those conditions, as well as the composition, what are the plant species that make them up, are different disturbance regimes. Our forests are by no means static. So when we're walking into a nice, cool, shady, high canopy forest, that forest is constantly changing. May not be so obvious to our eyes, but every once in a while there is some sort of an event, a disturbance, if you will, that comes in and makes things a little bit more obvious as it starts to change the forest. And those disturbances are really a key to realizing some of the habitat structural conditions that we look for to support these different bird species. Now here in the Northeast US, with our hardwood forests and our mixed forests, disturbance happens, right? It happens naturally all the time. And a couple of the main things that create those disturbances, those agents of change in our forests, are things like wind events, ice storms, insects and disease will kind of change the structure of the forest, cause tree mortality and cause those trees to fall. And those typically happen at relatively small scales on a somewhat frequent basis. And what we see here are two examples of the kind of disturbance that are somewhat common, so happening maybe annually or every decade in some of the bigger openings, that can affect our forests and enhance or change the structure and composition of them. So on the left, we actually see a picture from the Green Mountain Audubon Center that we have right here in Huntington, Vermont. This is from a relatively large wind event that hit us in 2017. And you can see that it took down not just one or two, but kind of a group of trees came down in that wind event and really opened up the canopy overhead where those trees came down. On the right side, we see there's a single tree that kind of tipped over. You can see the root mound that came along with it as it did that tipping, and some of the young growth that is now coming in that much smaller gap opening as a result of getting a little more sunlight on the forest floor. Both of these are natural events that happen. We expect them to happen in our forest. And when they do, they change the structure of the forest in ways like on the left, what we'll see as this forest starts to regrow new young trees in the understory, it will support a bird, again, like we've seen, we've talked about many times, the black-throated blue warbler, which utilizes that real dense understory layer in the forest. Or as we see on the right side, this is a hermit thrush, the Vermont state bird that might utilize the young softwood trees that are growing here as a place to actually put their nest as well. So disturbance is a key part of our forest. It's normal, it's natural, we embrace it. And it comes in different sizes and scales of intensity and frequency. On the other end of the spectrum are these events that cover a much larger area and tend to be historically much less frequent than those smaller events that we saw in the first slide. These are two slides from the Highstead, Vermont town forest, which is not too far from the Audubon Center. You'll see we had an event also back in 2011 that basically took about 35 to 40 acres and created the image that you see there on the left. It was what we might call a stand replacing event. So it was a very hard wind event that dropped and took down the majority of trees, the canopy trees within that stand. And it looks somewhat devastating when you first come out there and gaze upon it. But on the right, we can see now a few years later, the forest response to that with all of the openness, a lot of sunlight reaching that forest floor. We've had lots of regeneration and regrowth of trees and shrubs in the understory. And as a result, you can probably guess, if you've been with us before in particular, the type of habitat that has now been created by this rather significant wind event. And I'll show you a bird that we would expect to find. Two birds actually here. We have our chestnut-sided warbler on the right and the mourning warbler, which bird we haven't really talked a lot about, on the left, but both birds that utilize these open canopy young forest conditions. So prior to that wind event of 2011, it was a mature forest condition supporting birds like scarlet tanager, wood thrush, and black-throated blue warbler. And after that event and the regeneration that ensued, we find that we have these young forest birds coming in. And that's something that we want. We want to have a variety of different age classes of forests on the landscape so that a variety of different birds are able to find what they're looking for. Well, what we want to think about is how do we do this intentionally? How do we understand the natural disturbance regimes and patterns that affects our forests? and how can we manage our forests in ways that somewhat emulate those events, but in doing so allow us to not only enhance habitat, but to realize things like timber and non-timber forest products and other ecological services that can come along with them. So we're thinking really now about this topic called silviculture with birds in mind. And I realize that for some folks, that term silviculture, you may have heard of it before, you may be a little less familiar with what it actually means. So we'll have our barred owl help us to understand what that term silviculture means. I'll just kind of read it through here because it's one of those things that's it's just kind of good to hear the words that are used in this particular definition of silviculture. So silviculture is the art and science of controlling the establishment, growth, composition, health, and quality of forests and woodlands to meet the diverse needs and values of landowners and society on a sustainable basis. So many times I've heard people talk about silviculture, particularly with the objective of forest products in mind. We think of silviculture as what we employ if we're going to be generating a harvest for timber or a non-timber forest product. But in fact, if you look at this definition, you don't see the word timber or non-timber forest products in there at all. The thing I want to point out to you and kind of key you into is that silviculture is used to meet the diverse needs and values of landowners and society on a sustainable basis, of course. And so we can utilize silviculture to help us think about enhancing habitat for birds and other wildlife as well. But it's not mutually exclusive to birds and other wildlife. It certainly helps us to achieve some of those other objectives, which may include timber and non-timber forest products at the same time. So we're really going to be taking a deep dive here today into thinking about silviculture with birds in mind. A little bit more of a technical aspect to today's presentation. We're going to do our best to bring it down to understanding for all folks, regardless of what your background is with this topic. So some of the things that we're really going to be just kind of a review and reminder, some of the things that we're going to be thinking about trying to enhance or to establish within our forests that are going to help to increase the habitat quality in a mature forest now is where we're going to start. We're looking at forest structure. And just as a reminder, this is things like our understory and mid-story layers. So thinking about the forest not as just the canopy overhead, but multiple layers of vegetation. We're thinking about coarse and fine woody materials, so deadwood down on the forest floor. And we're thinking about snags, standing dead trees, or cavity trees, which could be live or dead and have holes and cavities in them that birds can utilize. We're also thinking about the composition of the forest. What are the plants that make up the understory, mid-story, the canopy overhead? So we're looking for a diversity of native plant species that are suitable to the site conditions in which we're managing. We're not trying to force a species to grow where it really doesn't want to grow. So we use silviculture really to help us to manipulate structure and composition of a forest. Today we're thinking about as our primary objective of enhancing bird habitat. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn things over to Nancy. Nancy and I will probably tag team a little bit as we go on from here, but Nancy's going to be taking the lead on most of this. Just a brief introduction to Nancy if you don't know her. Nancy is a county forester with the Vermont Department of Forests, Parks, and Recreation. She is also a co-founder of the Cold Hollow to Canada Regional Conservation Partnership Network. And I've known Nancy for many years. Just like last week, I mentioned Dan Kilborn had been with us really since the beginning here in Vermont as we were developing our forest bird conservation program. Nancy has been there just as long, if not even longer. As a representative of the Vermont Department of Forests, Parks, and Recreation, she has been our primary partner with the department on helping to develop programs such as Foresters for the Birds. And I've had the great pleasure over the years to work with Nancy, both doing things like we're doing today, but also being out in the woods. And she's a skilled forester, a skilled teacher, and I feel really honored to have her here with us today. So Nancy, I will turn it over to you. And if there's anything else you'd like to add or not, we'll jump ahead to the next slide.
Great. Thanks very much, Steve, for the terrific intro. So we are going for the next several slides. We're just going to be talking about different kinds of treatments that we've highlighted within the silviculture, book to move along and really focus on birds. But we're going to talk a little bit also about climate change habitat and climate change mitigation, and working together on these two topics. So we're going to start talking about tending treatments, which is a type of silviculture where we're looking at and sort of even aged management. It's early on. It's before we're thinking about regenerating the forest. We're really thinking about what we're doing in those younger forests. So we're going to start here, and there's two tending treatments we're going to discuss. The first one is crop tree release. Crop tree release is a form of management where you're really focusing your treatment on specific trees within the forest. One of the things that's really important for songbirds and for climate change mitigation is to keep a structure in the forest. So a typical thinning or a traditional thinning is a homogeneous treatment across the stand. Crop tree release is really focusing only on the trees that you're identifying as your future forest. And those crop trees can be determined by species. They can also be determined by a food source. For instance, an oak tree, if you find oak, you may choose that as a crop tree, or you may choose trees that you know may develop into a cavity tree even. It's not a tree that you're growing for a crop, but you're growing that tree to stay in the stand to have a particular function in the forest. It really helps in climate change mitigation when we're talking about crop tree release, because this is a time in the forest age development where we can really focus on the composition at that early stage. So you can really plan to have a great species diversity at this early age. You can really identify those trees to continue in the forest. So you have the greatest diversity of species possible for the forest and nature itself to choose down the road. So the greater diversity of species in our forest is going to be the best type of climate change mitigation. Plus, it provides those habitat needs and niches for a wide diversity of species, bird species. Now, if you look at the photo on the left, that's a forest that's been growing and getting crowded and not a lot of room to grow. So the crop tree release is identifying that one tree in that group where you want to expand the crown. And when you're doing that, you're also expanding the crown in a healthy crown so that you're getting a stronger development that can withstand ice and wind. As that crown develops, you're also developing that root system, which again can hold up against wind and ice storms, which is coming at more infrequent intervals with climate change. And if we go on to what the gap looks like, which is the next slide, you see we're just opening up the stand a little bit. This is the twist with thinking about songbird habitat management. Crop tree release doesn't typically within the books talk about gap formation, but for our purposes, these gap formations really enhance the structure of the forest vertically. So we can have these openings that are wonderful spaces for birds like the eastern wood pewee. They can come in and sally forth and get an insect load that's out in that opening. They love gaps. And the next slide can show what that gap looks like vertically at the ground level.
Oh, we actually jumped ahead to the different treatment.
So
go back here.
going back, we don't have a slide, we don't have a photo, I'm sorry, of what that ground level looks like. So, but one of the things about these gap formations that does enhance the forest structure is you will get a response of regeneration with that opening of that gap. So you're developing also nesting structure within this younger age class. So you're getting that variability of structure. And one of the things that's really important to remember that this is not a point where we're thinking about regenerating the forest per se, because if these gaps are so small that in a very short period of time that it will close up. So you're not really releasing regeneration. You are, however, developing that potential regeneration for release. It's not until the next time you enter into the forest where you will make that decision if you're going to expand that gap to release that regeneration and actually think about moving that forest into that stage. Right now, all we're thinking about is creating those gaps and allowing for structure.
Yeah, Nancy, maybe we could share when we're talking about gaps in this situation, right? We're talking about creating a small hole opening in the canopy. How big of a gap generally would we be thinking about to go along with this treatment?
Yeah, these are small gaps, and they would but certainly be less than a quarter of an acre. So we're a tenth of an acre, quarter of an acre, really simulating that single tree that has fallen down to open up a little bit of sunlight in the forest. So they're very small gaps, which, you know, as I described, they close in quickly.
Right, exactly. Yeah, thank you. And again, just to remind folks, this is enhancing mature forest. We're not trying to create that young forest at this place, which is why that small gap is really the key in this situation.
So moving on to include another form of tending. Again, the whole idea of managing for songbirds is to develop structure in the forest. And so we want to have we don't want a homogeneous stand, we want heterogeneity within our forest. So variable density thinning is a very, it's an ecological form of thinning that really looks at the forest as being, as it describes, variable in densities, which means that there will be places in the forest that you're thinning to release the crowns, just as you would in a regular thinning. But then there are areas where you don't treat at all, and they're called skips. So you don't go in and do anything. You actually leave that kind of as a way to carry on the pre-harvest forest without any interruption. So you're getting a dense stand in that place. So the stocking level is higher. The soils have been undisturbed. You have very layers in the forest. And then the third component of a variable density thinning would be those gaps. So you'd also include gaps within this type of thinning. Once again, we're not trying to regenerate the forest at this point in time. We're trying to grow the trees at a faster rate, in this case, a variable rate. In some cases, variable density thinning identifies areas that are permanent reserves. They're never cut, but those skips remain skips into the future. So there's a lot of ways to do this in the field, but it's another way to drive the species composition, drive those trees that need a little bit more sunlight to thrive in the canopy, so that you don't lose those trees that are a little less tolerant of shade, so we can maintain that wide species diversity within our forest. And at the same time, be developing that structure that's so important for climate change mitigation and for songbird habitat. You can see all those wonderful piles of wood on the forest floor. So that's providing habitat for songbirds and for foraging for birds.
Yeah, and I'm glad you pointed that out because this is something that Dan Kilborn talked about last week. And this is actually Dan here, the back of Dan Kilborn there in the orange vest on the right photo. These are photos from Mud Pond, which Dan used as a case study last week, and definitely want to point out that not only is it about creating the gaps in the canopy to try to stimulate structure, but that down woody material that has been left on site is just as important in thinking about habitat.
So this is another example of variable density thinning, which you can see is a little bit later on in the stage of the forest after harvest. You can see the wide diversity of structure within this forest. You have this is now at a point in time where you might next consider that further development of structure. There's a lot to work with here, and the layers are extremely important. We have layers in that 0 to 6 feet where the black-throated blue warblers do so well. And then there's that mid-story development is excellent, which is a place for things like wood thrush, as we can see here. We'll do find great nesting habitat. Again, foraging has a really high possibility here as well. So you can see the development structure in here is just what we're after in a thinning at this stage of the forest.
And Nancy, typically thinnings, if it was more of an area-wide thinning where we were trying to do a somewhat uniform approach to that, we wouldn't tend to expect to get this kind of structural development, correct?
That's correct. Typically, when you think about a traditional area-wide thinning, you're really looking at releasing across the entire stand, very uniform in structure, so that you're lowering the stocking level so that every tree has more space to grow. But they tend to be less diverse in structure, less ability for nesting habitat, and really designed more for timber growth. Now, these are, we're moving into where the forest, and we're really going to start talking about this long-term maintenance of the forest, where there's two very typical treatments that have been used in silviculture for a long time. One is called single tree and small group. And single tree, small group is just trying to develop the age class distribution in a regular way, so that there are equal amounts of small trees, medium-sized trees, and large trees. The small group that comes into this is really mimicking nature in respect to that one really large tree that may die for whatever reason. It dies from age or insect or a disturbance. So you're losing a fairly large tree that creates a gap in the forest that could be actually up to almost close to a quarter acre, but between that, a little more than 1/10 of an acre. But how we call it small group, we add that small group piece into it because our forests are typically younger in age than where we don't have a lot of those very large old mature trees. You may indeed have 5 trees that are smaller in diameter that you cut together in a group to mimic what would have been maybe a very large sugar maple or a very large oak tree with a vast crown. So you're really just mimicking the holes in the disturbance that would be in a natural forest, usually because our forests are at a younger age class. So single tree, small group, again, just to be really clear, is developing that structure in the forest that is sort of regular in nature. Now, in terms of developing songbird habitat, it's an excellent way to do it, because what we are talking about is developing that crown development at every level in the forest structure. So in that young trees with good crowns, medium-sized trees with excellent crowns as well. So this is sort of a crown management type of treatment with those age classes. So we're getting a lot of structure in the forest. You can see in this particular forest, we've got a wide diversity of species. So again, you can drive the species composition. Group selection is very similar, that we're trying to develop that multiple ages over time, but we do it a little bit differently with group selection. Group selection is, I just quickly to go back, the gap size in the single tree, again, as I described, really just mimics one big old tree. In group selection, we're getting into a much larger gap in the forest. So it can be, for songbird habitat management, we like to think about up to an acre. So between that quarter of an acre and acre in size, so you're developing a pretty big hole in the forest. So you're going to get a different suite of species. You may indeed get some early successional species or mid-tolerant shade trees, mid-tolerant shade trees, which are diversifying the forest with another goal for climate change mitigation. So diversifying the forest. Now group selection is done on a regular basis as well. So you're defining how much of that forest is going to be put into gaps. So typically it's somewhere around 20% of the forest will have gaps in it of up to an acre in size. Then the forest outside of those gaps are then tended, similar to what we talked about earlier, where you're using crop tree release, or you can use area-wide thinning. In this case, area-wide thinning is applicable because you're developing the structure elsewhere. But we can use crop tree release as an excellent method for habitat throughout the forest. And the other, we could use variable variable density thinning, but in reality, we've got our variability with our group selection. So it makes more sense to use a group selection with crop tree release. And those gaps are a little bit larger, really driving that species composition.
Yeah, and as noted here, this is at the Green Mountain Audubon Center, where we have a demonstration area, demonstration site in our forest that was harvested 2011, 2012 winter. So this photo was in 2017, so about 5 years after the harvest. So this was one of those group selections. And if you recall back to when we started the presentation today, and I shared some of those natural disturbance events that were created, this is very similar actually in size to the left side photo that I mentioned was from a wind event in 2017 that hit a different area of the property. So what we're trying to do is to emulate some of those same conditions. And correspondingly, I could ask folks to just think about what is one bird species that we would be looking to or expect to find here. So we've enhanced the habitat. I can tell you the understory of this forest did not look like you see here right now prior to this opening being created. So what bird species might we be providing habitat for that was previously not being provided? You don't need to put it in chat unless you want to, but just to think about that. We've had a chance to talk about some of these birds repeatedly, and it would be the black-footed blue warbler. Would be one bird that we'd expect to find here as a result of this work. And I can tell you that we have been finding more of them in this forest.
So we'll move on to another treatment that's being used quite commonly in the forest these days. This is an old method actually that has been used in Europe for hundreds of years, really. We're really talking about irregular shelterwood management here. And it's really designed to create the most diverse structure in the forest. In this case, we're going to be talking about expanding gap irregular shelterwood. There are many different variations of irregular shelterwoods, but these are really important to be used in forests that are degraded. So we use these often to recover a forest. So we're talking about restoration, ecological forestry restoration, really bringing a forest back to a good condition. And this is a really excellent system to be using here. The gaps right at the beginning, we'll see in a minute, but the gaps here are really talking about less than an acre of gap size, that between 1/4 of an acre and an acre in size, which again mimics the natural disturbance regime that we have in the northern forest. Those small wind events are how our forest evolved. So we're recreating what nature would be doing on its own. This is a really terrific photo of the Green Mountain Audubon Center with a few years of growth there. And you can see that there's a really good response of regeneration in this stand. So we're going to go through just a bit of a schematic to talk about what expanding gap irregular shelterwood looks like. If you go in at this point in time with this first step, it actually looks like a group selection. So you can do these groups and you can tend or not tend. And as a matter of fact, one of the things that is a little bit different with a regular shelterwood is that some people choose not to do anything but the groups, the gaps, and not to tend outside the gaps. It's a choice to be made. You can do it or not. But within these gaps, there's always retention. There's always going to be trees left within the gaps that stay permanently. It's a wonderful way to retain that structural element of old trees. So by creating these gaps, and we keep a tree or some trees in those gaps, those trees aren't going to be harvested the next time around. And Steve, you can go on and show what some of these schematics look like. That's the next stage. The gaps are expanding, and they're expanding wherever regeneration has taken place. We don't just make a donut hole and expand the gap. We're really looking at where the trees have responded, and we want to release those trees next in line. It's also really important to put a road system in that does not go through the gaps, and that road system is repeatedly used in each of these entries so that you're not running over the wonderful regeneration that you've created. So again, the next stage of where we go next. And again. So you can see where this forest has now been treated over the years. And this is an accelerated version over a 50-year time period that we're expanding those gaps. So you're going to have a really diverse structure in your forest. And again, remembering within these gaps, you are retaining trees, you're retaining dead standing, you're retaining trees that you want to live to their biological lifespan. You're retaining down woody material. This is the place where you're really mimicking what nature does on its own. This again is it's a simple process of laying out a plan and following through over a period of time to mimic nature.
And Nancy, one of the things too that I know we've talked about is that sometimes those natural gaps, those natural disturbance gaps that are created, those can almost serve as that initial gap creation. So when we come back in, we would even expand on those kinds of gaps. They don't have to be just the gaps that we've harvested.
Yeah, so that's the beauty of silviculture, as Steve described, is the art and science. So there is a true art in doing what we do. And you choose those points of gap openings from many ways. One being it's already started. So you're expanding a gap that nature's already begun. Or it's a place where there's regeneration that is very successful and you want to release that regeneration. So you can create a gap to release advanced regeneration that's already there. There are lots of ways in thinking about where you want to put those gaps. The important part is that you're following through from those gaps and expanding those in each entry. So this is, I think we had got one more to go that just continues to show the schematic, and we'll show you another schematic in a moment. So there, I'm seeing a question quickly. I haven't been following the chat, but there is a question on what's the time frame, and the time frame between treatments can really vary. If your forest is heavily degraded and you're looking at restoration, you may go in more frequently and stop at 50 years and then tend for 50 years. In private lands, that's a little bit harder to do because land ownership changes and it's complicated. On public lands, that's something that's done or a research forest. But there's also the idea if you don't really want to affect more than 1% per year of disturbance. So if you go in every 10 years, you're thinking about 10% of the forest you're going to be disturbing in that gap. Often you can change, you can move those every 10 years, every 15 years, or every 20 years you go in with a time interval. Really depends on how old you're growing your trees, how quickly you need to turn that forest over in terms of restoration. Sometimes these forests have been heavily had exploitive harvesting for a long time. So this is a great way to restore those forests. Looking at these schematics here, you can see what that forest actually does over time. At the top level, that's your initial gap with your retention. The next time in, you're going in a few years later and you're going to see the growth of those trees. And then by the fifth harvest, you've got your mature forest is now where your gap was. So it's this manipulation of the forest over time. And then you just keep on going. Now you have new gaps where you've expanded that forest, and that gap will then be expanded repeatedly. So eventually you come back to your initial stand. That's when you want to make sure when you're identifying, you're back after 50 or 60 years. Some of those trees will still be alive. Some of those initial retention trees may still be there. And those trees again get to live through their biological lifespan. This is just a beautiful photograph. I love this one. This comes out of Maine, actually. It's Bob Seymour's photo. But you can see so clearly the three different stages of expanding gap. You're actually standing in the older part of the forest, looking into the picture, and you're looking at where a gap had been expanded. So where the people are standing, that's a 4-year-old gap. That was where people that had been cut 4 years ago, and there's just beginning to get a little regeneration. And beyond that is the initial part of the gap that was cut 14 years before this picture, so that you can see the variability in structure that's developed here. So really great for songbird habitat, for a multitude of different niches and availability for a wide diversity of songbirds in this forest, as well as a great way to manage the forest to be responsive to climate change impacts.
Great. And so that kind of wraps up thinking about enhancing the mature forest. And now we're going to move into creating some of that young forest. If we go back to our second webinar, for those of you who were here, if you weren't here, I'll briefly review. We really like to take this landscape view of an area that we're managing to identify whether it would be desirable or not based on landscape condition to create these patches or areas of young forest, or also known as early successional habitat. So in those scenarios where we deemed it valuable from a bird habitat perspective to create those conditions, we may want to go in and do that. Also, just given other forest objectives, landowner objectives, we may be creating that young forest as well. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about some of our silvicultural options with birds in mind for creating a condition that may be absent on the landscape.
Yeah, the thing about these openings and groups and gaps, you can think of them as the smaller the gap is going to be closing in more quickly. So group selection, we look at 1 to 2 acres. So when we're thinking about the songbird habitat work that we were just describing, we really only are going up to 1 acre for those interior songbirds. But when you start going into group selection that are with groups a little larger, 1 to 2 acres, you're really going to get some of those young forest birds in there. So, name me some birds, Steve.
Well, there's one right there. Just flew in. The white-throated sparrow.
Chestnut. White-throated sparrow or chestnut
Chestnut-sided.
Both of those are really good in here, but white-throated sparrow is the northern bird, and it loves these openings, and it loves patchiness as well. So group selection creates some of that, but again, it's a smaller area. We look at patch cuts being 2 to 5 acres in size. They're a little bit larger, and then we get into clear cuts that are even larger. And what Steve showed you earlier with a large disturbance that had taken place in the town forest in Heinsberg, that would be considered a clear cut with retention. So there were trees left in that gap naturally. So naturally, we like to still, in all of these clear cut conditions, it's important to think about leaving that retention both in large standing trees, dead snags, and coarse woody material on the ground. But these areas are ideal for nesting habitat for those young forest birds, as well as fabulous foraging habitat for all of the songbirds, actually.
Yeah, especially during that post-breeding season. As we've discussed in earlier webinars, we know that some of our mature forest birds, like the scarlet tanager, the wood thrush, etc., bring their young to these patches once they've fledged from the nest. And this is where they provide good cover from predations, where they find plentiful, usually fruit resources. A lot of fruit producing trees and shrubs often found in these open young forest areas. So there's kind of a dual purpose there, not just nesting habitat for birds like the white-throated sparrow we see here, but also that post-breeding habitat usage. So definitely a part of the landscape that we want to make sure is represented at the right scale.
And this is another form of a regular shelter wood with reserves. And so this kind of does create that almost like a savanna at a certain point in time. So we have these older trees providing structure, but it's open enough to provide a young forest condition as well. And some of these shelter wood with reserves, this would be, I expect there to be another harvest in here, but some of those trees will be retained most likely permanently, or at least carried on to another treatment. So we're maintaining structure in the forest at the same time where we're creating those young forest conditions. So this kind of has two things going on at the same time.
Yeah, and sometimes we'll we'll still find the mature forest nesting birds in these areas as well, at least before the cut that might remove the overstory here. And one of the things that is always important to keep in mind with this young forest, whether it be these larger group selections, patch cuts, clear cuts, or the shelterwood with reserves kinds of approaches, is that they are ephemeral in nature. So you create them and they don't persist on the landscape forever. As those trees grow back in, they reach a height of, say, 20 feet tall or even more than that. If you've been in those kinds of places, you'll know that eventually that canopy closing in overhead causes that real low dense cover, which is what the birds are looking for, to move away, to go away. It gets shaded out. And so at that point, those stands of the forest stands no longer meet the habitat, the nesting habitat or post-breeding habitat needs of those birds. So we're left with kind of a question as the landowners and the land managers. If we want to see these conditions on the landscape, how do we make sure that happens? So we could go back into this area that we see here after that growth occurs, and we could just cut it all back and keep managing this one spot to maintain those conditions. A lot of times what happens is we go and we find another place on the landscape, which is right. The timing is right. Silviculturally, the trees are either the quality is low or just it makes sense to do that kind of treatment. And we let this grow up to become mature forest in time, and we manage it as mature forest as opposed to young forest. So it's that question that's always being asked of where should we create these? How much of this young forest should we create? We've discussed that in some of the other webinars, so we won't go into depth on that again. But it is something we have to, either natural events cause it somewhat infrequently, although it could be argued that it's happening more frequently as a result of a changing climate, these events that kind of create the bigger stand replacing situations. But we can also do them ourselves through our own manipulation and application of silviculture.
Here we're talking about, we're not just growing this. Steve said early on, silviculture is not about timber or non-timber forest products. It's about the forest overall, the ecosystem function within the forest. And there certainly are non-commercial species that are never going to be harvested for a product that are extremely valuable for the forest in general, songbirds, of course, and maintaining the structure and function within the forest. So this is a picture of hobblebush, one of my very favorite species. It's heavily used by birds like black-throated blue warbler. And there's even been some evidence shown that where moose are common and browsing on the hobblebush, keeping it low and more shrubby, it's even better habitat for black-throated blue warbler. So that's one example, but there are myriad examples. Chokecherry is another species that is just providing a wonderful food source for songbirds in the late summer. That also provides a great architectural structure for the birds to be nesting in. You can think about a wide diversity of all kinds of species, plant species that are good for songbirds. We've even found a nest kind of tucked into a fern frond before. We don't really think of ferns as being something that we maintain for songbird habitat, but the birds are making those choices, and they're usually more right than we are. So we want to just keep, and of course things work together. The importance of ephemerals in the forest to soak up the nutrients, to hold them there in place. Everything has its role, everything has its purpose. And some of these non-commercial species are heavily used as nesting habitat and for foraging for migrating songbirds.
Yeah. And when we do these treatments that we've been discussing, we have a desired response, things that we hope will happen, both just getting that growth coming in there and not having it be browsed by deer or have maybe ferns come in, as Nancy just mentioned. But we have something that we hope will occur from our songbird habitat. Even having these non-commercial species, as Nancy just said, are part of that desired mix of plant species. But there's also situations where the non-desirable vegetation may come in.
Yes, when we think about non-native and primarily invasive plants, that disrupts the natural balance of our forests. If invasive plants often take over a site that really limit the ability for native trees to regenerate, we're going to lose our ability for our forests to recover from disturbance. So that's a real negative when it comes to climate change adaptation. If the forest is taken over by things like barberry, as you can see on the right, and that forest can't regenerate, the forest has a limited time frame for existence, really, and to thrive. These plants also change the soil chemistry. They provide a food source that is not as nutritious or as abundant across time as our native plants do. If it's all honeysuckle, there's not a variation of fruits growing in a forest. It's just that one kind. Also the architectural structure of some of these invasive plants, honeysuckle is a good example. Honeysuckle, birds will choose to nest in a honeysuckle, but they don't often succeed there because the leaf structure of the honeysuckle is just on the outer edge. So a predator can find that nest so easily. So it's actually a real sink for songbird nesting that they'll be preyed on quite much more easily than in our native diversity of native shrubs and regenerating tree species. And again, the fruit source, depending on what we're looking at, buckthorn is a diuretic, the fruit is, so it goes right through the animal, and the songbirds aren't really gaining any nutritional value from those fruits, and it's being spread all over the place. Honeysuckle too, it does have some level of nutrition, but not as good as our native plants. And again, as I described, it's the architecture of that plant is harmful. So we really, and it's not just that, it's not just the songbird habitat, it's our forest overall. By minimizing the diversity that exists in our forest, the native diversity, we are setting our forest up for a failure when disturbance occurs, when it's less resilient to that response. So eliminating or mitigating or managing invasive plants has become something that is absolutely a requirement when we're managing forests.
Yeah, and the photo on the left there is actually at our Green Mountain Audubon Center. In one of our gaps where we found Asiatic bittersweet coming in, and Nancy hit it on the head. It's not, in most places, it's not a question of, well, if the invasives come in, we'll have to think about how we're going to manage them. It's more of a when, really, in most situations now. And I know that for our friends in more of southern New England and mid-Atlantic, you've been dealing with things like bittersweet for longer than we have here in northern Vermont. But it certainly is becoming something that is more common. We're finding it showing up in more places. And so making sure that we are committing our resources to addressing and trying to maybe not eradicate, because in some cases that's not even an issue, or excuse me, an option anymore. It's an issue, not an option. It's just how are we going to manage it to make sure that it doesn't become, to try to control in the best we can some ways. And Nancy mentioned all the reasons from a habitat as well as a forest health perspective, why that's a really important thing to do. So it's not sufficient enough simply anymore to go in and say, we're going to implement silviculture, manage our forest, and everything is going to turn out exactly the way we hope that it will. There's more to the story now that we have to continue to be monitoring and being willing to address issues that arise along the way. So all of this, kind of wrapping us up here to a conclusion, being intentional is one of my favorite ways to describe all of this work. Being intentional in thinking about and incorporating birds into the management of our forest. We can manage forests in ways that enhance habitat for birds and are beneficial to birds, but we didn't do it intentionally. There's value beyond the birds in my mind for doing things with that intention for birds. And it comes through what we see here, the people that are involved in this. This really brings us back even to the first webinar now. People are conservation. And in the terms of managing our forests, the more people we can have engaged in understanding these things like we've discussed today, the better off we're going to be in realizing it and seeing it happening, kind of creating this culture where people are managing in ways that support birds and overall forest health. So on the right, we've got, this dates me a little bit. This goes back before I had gray in my beard, but in the center there is the Audubon biologist. We have the landowner on the left, and then the private consulting forester for that landowner on the right, all in the woods together, all talking about ways that we can be managing our forest to achieve these multiple goals, one of which is bird habitat along the way, and getting everybody really on the same page. Then on the left, we actually have a state lands forester, Tim Morton, and the logger that was doing some work. This was in the Coolidge State Forest, where they were demonstrating silviculture with birds in mind as well. So now we have the forester talking directly and helping that logger to understand, why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we leaving so much downwoody material on the forest floor and not pulling that out or utilizing it in some way? So all of these people are really the solution to realizing the outcomes that we're looking for and that we've been hoping for all along the way. So with that, we pretty much wrapped up the presentation. Want to just, again, thank Nancy. Nancy's going to stick around with us for folks' questions as well, which we'll get to here in just a few moments. But I wanted to remind folks that we have one more webinar in the series. Typically, we've been doing these every week for the last 3 weeks. The next one, which is, we're going to skip a week. So this will be on October 13th. And it'll be the final webinar in this 4-part series, with the topic being technical and financial assistance for RCPs, conservation partners, and landowners. So we're going to hear from a variety, mostly Audubon partners will be doing the presenting, and they'll be talking in different states within the RCP network. They'll be talking about programs and opportunities that they offer to RCPs and landowners for really intentionally thinking about bringing birds to the management of those forests in those states in which you may be. And we're going to hear from, again, a variety of folks from New York to Maine, Massachusetts, Connecticut, et cetera. So really looking forward, hope folks can join us for that, to find out where there are opportunities to connect with professionals to help really move it forward in the places that you all live. As always, feel free to reach out to me with questions about forestry for the birds, forest bird conservation with my email address there. And if you're interested in hearing more about the Northeast Bird Habitat Conservation Initiative, or the work at Highstead or the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Katie would be the contact for Highstead, and Sarah for Cornell and the Northeast Bird Habitat Conservation Initiative. So just as a reminder, we're going to have, if it's not up already in the chat, there is going to be a link to, if you're looking to get CFEs, forestry education credits, you can click on that link to access a place where you can put down your information to receive the category 1 CFE for this webinar today. Folks, we invite you and hope you can stick around for a little bit longer for questions, but if you do need to go, certainly understand that, and we can let you go for the day. So once again, thank you all for being here. I'm going to stop sharing the screen and we'll jump into the questions.
Hi, Steve and Nancy. Thank you. That was a fantastic talk. Very excellent. We have a question from Brian. Are there any species in our area that prefer large areas with structure, with homogeneous structure, or are forests with diverse structure always better for the birds? So he means a simple structure, perhaps only a high canopy without subcanopy or understory or herb layer.
Sure. So I wouldn't say there are birds that prefer or are specifically looking for those more structurally simple forests, but some of the birds that may rely on that structure more than others would be, or excuse me, rely on it less than others would be some of the ground nesting species. So like an ovenbird, the key characteristic of a forest for an ovenbird, which is a very common warbler here in our Northeast forest is a well-developed leaf litter layer. And so they'll just nest right on the forest floor. They'll pull that leaf litter together to create kind of a dome nest, and that's where you'll find them laying their eggs. But by and large, it's that structurally complex forest really that pretty much meets the needs of most birds. I don't have any birds that are preferentially looking for forests that are structurally simple.
Yeah, I would say even the birds that like those pockets of simple structure, like, you think about a grouse where they thrive where there's an aspen coppice, they still need that older forest just nearby. So that needs to be juxtaposed with a structure. Golden winged warbler, blue winged warbler, those are species too that like that young forest, but they must have that older forest nearby to thrive. So they're really, the structure, while it may be a little bit diverse across the landscape, the structure still required for all of these neotropical songbirds.
So you already addressed invasive species a bit, and we have a couple questions, and one is specific, really asking, do you use these techniques when forests are in part invaded by Norway maples? And then how to prevent invasive buckthorn coming in as an understory? And can gap creation from Norway removals be controlled so that native species come back?
So the best thing when you're managing invasive plants, we like to think about pre-treatment first, but if you're looking at a Norway maple stand, so you're removing that Norway maple, the seed source is there. So you need to develop, you need to mix things up so that the seed source of other native plants are going to thrive as well. And, up here, I don't have a lot of opportunity to see Norway maple maturing in a forest. But I know that is common in other places. So removing the Norway maple, mixing up the forest, scarifying the soil, making sure you have a seed source right there. Yellow birch would be a perfect seed source for a scarified soil. So making sure you have a seed source that's present, removing the invasive plants, and then monitoring is going to be essential, particularly with things like Norway maple. They're prolific seeders and they thrive in our habitat. So you need to go back in to make sure you're removing those Norways after treatment. So pre-treatment and post-treatment monitoring. And the same thing with buckthorn. So it's pre-treatment. And one of the ways that you're doing some of this, it depends on the treatment that you're using, but if you're doing something like small gap creation or group selection, that pre-treatment around the gap is going to be really important so that you don't have those invading into the group.
Excellent, thank you. There's a question here from Charles. It says, can you address the practical issue of getting contractors to come do the work in the case of enhancing mature forest, minimize job size, etc.? Not necessarily worth moving equipment for small jobs. Are the techniques used in demonstration and research practical within the broad sweep of land ownership?
That's just a great question. And I guess what I would say is that, yes, I think the silvicultural treatments are applicable across a really, really wide range of land ownership. You might tailor something depending on the size. There's also funding available in most states through the Natural Resource Conservation Service that will pay for some of this work to be done when it's non-commercial. There's other opportunities to combine properties together and to treat them as one. It's something we've done up in Cold Hollow to Canada in our woodlots groups, is that we work on more than one parcel at a time so that you can get a better economic return. There's also a wide variety of equipment sizes out there. So I think when you're working with foresters, most consulting foresters have a suite of different contractors of varying size equipment, varying size crews to do this kind of work. And some of this work you can do, individuals can do themselves. So there really are, you can affect songbird habitat and climate change regardless of the size of the property you have.
Yeah, and I would just I agree completely with that. I would add that I think it's less about the fact that we're managing to enhance a mature forest than it is that certain smaller properties may be difficult, though, nonetheless, to still attract certain operators to want to bring their equipment on site when there might be another job that's going to be more lucrative to them just down the road. So I think smaller parcels can be challenging to simply find the operators to work there. As Nancy said, though, if we can find funding sources to help cover those costs where there may not be enough material being harvested to actually cover it itself, so it's not a commercial job. The other thing I wanted to mention, just as it's kind of a pilot that's happening here in Vermont right now, but it's an interesting model that I'm looking forward to seeing how it goes. Audubon is partnering with a group called the Vermont Youth Conservation Corps, which is starting up. It's an organization that's going for quite some time, and they do a lot of, they're known mostly for their trail work, but they've developed a forestry program where they're giving young adults some opportunities to get experience in forestry and safely felling trees and the operations around all of that. And we're trying to pair them up with sites where it is harder to get a commercial operator to come in and do that work. There's still funding needed, but it's a workforce that may be available where a logging contractor may not be interested. And we'll see how that can work and could really kind of meet this need, this kind of niche where the question is specifically addressing.
Right. So we have a question here from Will. Are regeneration treatments species specific, like in tending treatments you mentioned, or is regen more locational in harvest selection?
So yes, it really does depend on what species you have. So there's silviculture is actually designed around natural communities. So it really depends on what you want to grow, how shade tolerant something might be, how much sun it might need. So when we're talking today about silviculture treatments, it was really in quite a general, broader term. When you come down to the suite of species that you're looking for, there are tweaks to about how you go about that management. How big is the gap going to be? Where is the seed source located? So yes, there's a lot of that art and there's a lot of science involved with the layout of a job. But in terms of location in a harvest selection, that actually also drives the silviculture. Where does the regeneration currently exist? Where is it successful? Where is it having trouble with competing vegetation, invasive species, or other species that you don't want to be the only species in the stand, where you want to have diversity? So yes, there's a lot of nuance in these treatments.
So that is all the questions that I see right now in the chat. So I'd like to welcome anyone to unmute and ask a question. If you have one more burning question, I think we have a moment. Anyone? Well, it looks like maybe that's it. Thanks so much, Steve and Nancy. We really appreciate you speaking with us today.
Great to be here, and thank you all for joining us. Again, reach out with questions if you have any. We're more than happy to help answer them for you.
Thanks, everyone. We look forward to seeing you at the next session, the next webinar.
Great.
Right.
2 weeks from today.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.